Good afternoon. We're here for our City Council work session. It's Monday, January 24th, 2022. We're here to hear development strategies update on the Uptown redevelopment workshop, and Andy is going to give us a quick introduction, and then we'll go from there. So.
All right. I believe who we have on the call with us today are Matt Letley and Justin Carney, Jim Concepcion, and Kate Medlin and Miriam Keller from Development Strategies. And they're visiting us via Zoom from St. Louis. And they're going to go through where they're at in their process now, processing everything from the first two workshops. Get council's feedback on it. And I'm wondering kind of this opportunity for y'all to have some back and forth with them before they got too far involved in the final recommendations.
Sounds great. If Matt or Mary, if they want us to lead it off.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, City Council, for having us all. I can, on our end, we can hear you all fantastically, but I have to squint quite a bit to see you all individually. But we're looking forward to having this conversation. Very much thank you to Andy for that kickoff. I think that's a great summation of where we are, where we are putting some plans in front of you, but they're not finished plans. They are a culmination of a lot of thinking and assembly of information and thoughts from the public input, which we're going to share with you from two public meetings, pop-up events, online surveys, a variety of ways of getting information, conversations with property owners, conversations with city staff, and our own professional expertise. And we're really at a point where we've got an assemblage of information to share with you all, and we really need some direction on how to proceed as we refine the plan further. So not a finished plan, but a lot of thinking, and as you're going to see, a lot of it's an important site and a lot of important decisions to be made, but also a lot of opportunity. So we'll be sharing that with you, and this is, I think, from our perspective, very much a continuation of the strategic plan that you all invited us to undertake with you all back in 2020. This is one of the key sites that emerged from that conversation, and that I think it was clear to everyone in that process that this area is very complex, but also rich in opportunity. And this is really that process to really zero in and drill down on this particular space in the center of your community, and try to address the reality of several things while harnessing this site to create a community benefit. So I think with that, we'll kind of roll into the presentation here. So looking at this site, this was the opportunity, and this entire area was the opportunity that we saw. I think before even coming to your community, it jumped out to us as city planners. This whole triangle, right in the heart of your community, a lake, and access to College Avenue, which is your College Town Main Street. And as we got into the strategic plan, we found that this was the consistent theme. No matter who we talked to, residents, business owners, property owners, no matter what people's priorities were for the community, everyone agreed this site could be something special. It's not serving the community to its fullest potential today, and I think people had across all walks an aspiration that this be something better than what it is today. And the opportunity, as you're going to see in some of the alternatives, is really an opportunity and a funding strategy to invest in Abernathy Park, expand on it, improve it, create a whole new district with a street network and a high quality of place right in the heart of your community, as opposed to something that has some quality businesses, but it's not really possible to get around in a, you know, it doesn't have a pedestrian realm. What you have are a lot of curb cuts and disjointed properties today, and resources to advance community priorities both on the site and, as you'll see, potentially other broader community priorities as well. And I think it's worthwhile to acknowledge that a consistent theme in so many places we work, and I think this very much speaks to Clemson, that we did a strategic plan. Many members of the community have said what some of their priorities are. Many of you expressed what your priorities are, or your constituents. And a lot of times when you come right out of a plan, you end up in a situation where you have to talk about and address the situation at hand, and it might not be, one of the top priorities on your wish list. That's often the case, and so what we're trying to do is really create a plan that addresses some immediate development pressures, some immediate realities, but does so in a way that is strategic and creates opportunities to fund both on-site and off some of those strategic priorities that you all in the community listed as important. So we want to address the reality of student housing, and we'll talk about that a little more, but do so in a master planned way with cohesive and coherent development that through an assemblage you can create a meaningful district, fund some of those initiatives, and complement otherwise limited funding alternatives. When we looked at some of the other tools that are available, some of them require coordination and partnerships with other jurisdictions that just may not be possible right now. This is probably the best opportunity this area represents economically, the best opportunity to fund, to create funds for a lot of these strategic priorities of any of the development sites that we identified. And there's an opportunity to mitigate some of the market pressure going forward. So we'll talk about that in a more detailed way in just a second. And a recurring theme, something that we've shared with the public, that we've talked about in all the public meetings, but it's worth mentioning again. And we're trying to find that intersection for this area between a fundable redevelopment, but also an approvable one. So in other words, we can come up with something that is realistic in terms of financeable project, but that's very easy to do, I think. But if it's not community supported, it's not going to be approvable, right? So that's not a real project. And then conversely, we could draw a number of things and not draw a number of things that we feel would make most everybody happy, but we feel it would be disingenuous to present that to you if it's not grounded in economic or market reality, if it's not real, in other words. So what you're going to see is our best effort at really assembling all the public feedback, assembling what we know about economics, markets, and putting forth a fundable plan. And ultimately, it's up to you all as community leaders, as city council, to determine whether it's approvable. But that's really been our goal, is coming up with something that addresses realities, but is approvable, and do so by creating something that's, yes, realistic, but that creates a lot of community benefit. The plan does not, in every instance, show everything that everybody wants, but we believe what you'll see are something we've talked about on the next slide, a lot of trade-offs. By allowing certain things to happen and mitigating their negative impacts, there's an opportunity to do a lot of things that this community has expressed that they do want to see. Next slide, Miriam. So, and one other thing we want to just be really clear about when we talk about the reality of student demand, because there's a couple of different ways to look at student housing, which we know is not on anybody's kind of wish list. It's our top priority, something you want to see more of, but it is a reality that, again, when we're talking about addressing things This is a big part of what we're talking about. So one way to look at student housing demand is the total number of beds, right? There's X number of students, and that requires X number of beds, and are we in relative equilibrium? And we've heard a lot of conversation around that, and not just here, but in a lot of university communities that we work in. But there's another type of demand, which I think is more relevant to what you're seeing and what so many communities are seeing, and what we're trying to, what this plan is trying to address, which is related to the growth in parent incomes. It's related to the fact that you're in a thriving economic region and part of the country that is producing more wealth, and it's also producing more demand on degrees from flagship institutions like yours. So we want to be crystal clear that what we're talking about is the increased affluence of the student population and their increased demand for luxury housing. So this is why you're seeing so many development proposals for high-end luxury housing, and it's growing. This demand is growing at a rate that far outpaces university growth in terms of total number of students. So we want to be clear that everything we're looking at says this university is going to continue to be more selective. Degrees here are going to continue to be in more demand, and there's a rising affluence of those students and their parents. So you're going to continue to see development proposals for luxury housing, whether or not the total number of beds are in equilibrium. So that's what we're trying to address. We're trying to address that reality. And the closer those can be addressed to campus or to transit as per our strategic plan, the better that's going to be for traffic. And what we're doing is, in a relative sense, and what we're doing is trying to paint a picture of how through assemblage, this in conjunction with other kinds of development and other community amenities can lead to a more amenitized place and more community benefit. Next slide, Miriam. So, and that's what we're talking about with that strategic plan. Just to zoom out for a second, when we created the strategic plan, it was really about how can we create a plan in which most of this community, 95%, 98% of all the land use, in existing areas can remain as it is, more or less. Where can we identify sites largely in existing commercial areas that can accommodate some of this development, alleviate some of this demand pressure, in a way that creates less negative impacts than having it occur outside of your community and having all those cars drive in, ways that put less impact and less pressure on existing single-family housing to get rented out to student housing. How can we focus it in some key areas that are direct to transit? And then how can we also create some opportunities for workforce housing and affordable housing in some other key development areas? And can we leverage some of that student housing for revenue to help facilitate some of these other strategic goals, including affordable and workforce housing and transit? So that was kind of the idea, and this was the largest, most visible, richest in opportunity area that we didn't identify for largely preservation use in kind of the core of your community. Next slide. So that's what this plan seeks to do: address the market reality of student housing, maximize community benefit, and ground those options in real economic numbers. Next slide. So what we're going to do for the next, 30 minutes is kind of walk you through this, okay? Miriam's going to share with you what we've heard so far. She's going to share with you the summary of the community input that we've had from the public meetings and surveys and various tools that we use. And then I'm going to walk you through feasibility considerations. We're going to have a little bit of just a very brief refresher on some of the market analysis we did, community goals, place and design, probably cover all of that in about 5 minutes, and really focus on economic feasibility. We've assessed the economics of development in this area, and we want to share with you what some of our conclusions are at a high level, and also think about what you could potentially fund, what community benefit could be generated from development. We'll probably pause there because I'm certain you all will have lots of comments for us, which is what we need. We need that feedback. And then we'll kind of share with you, hopefully we'll have maybe 15 minutes left at the end, kind of walk you through implementation and next steps, where we are in the process, and also what could happen after this plan and how that would look, and how things like a zoning overlay and other elements would fit into an implementation effort. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miriam, and she's going to share with you what we've heard from the community.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I want to take a moment to sort of remind everybody about the process for this. And like any planning effort, this really is a dialogue. So our team is bringing our real estate expertise, our ability to evaluate economic feasibility, all those things Matt just said, and we'll describe in more detail later. So we're bringing that to the table, but then, of course, it is critically important that we understand where community members are in terms of what they want to see, what their aspirations for Uptown are, and figure out how that all comes together into something that's both fundable and approvable, like Matt was kind of sharing in the early slides. And we've had and continue to have a lot of ways of having that dialogue. So there have been community workshops where we had boards and interactive tools, online surveys, and a couple of videos to get the word out about this effort. Conversations with property owners to understand kind of where they are and what some of their constraints are. Real boots on the ground, walking tours with staff on their own, just taking a lot of time to get to know the site. And this has been kind of the basis of a really valuable dialogue. And here is where we are in the process. So in steps 1 and 2, we had a public workshop each. And of course, I know many of you participated and were there for those conversations. And also a survey after each of those workshops, and that's what I'm going to kind of describe how, kind of in combination, we heard some key themes that shaped the land use alternatives that we put together, and then also some of the feasibility considerations we've been looking at in this third stage where we are now, this refined stage. We've been working real closely with staff to understand many things, including kind of the zoning considerations and land use considerations that accompany the types of things that we've been envisioning in dialogue with the community. And we have refinement yet to go after this. So this conversation will be really critical for us to take your input back and continue refining the land use alternatives, thoughts about implementation, and then kind of set the stage for land use regulations working with staff. In the next stage, we will have an open house coming back to present the refined framework while we also develop a final plan to document the entire process. And so what have we heard so far in a combination of the community workshops and the surveys? Again, we've had what we feel like is really great participation from community members. Just want to take a moment to thank city staff for helping us plan and execute some really great events. A lot of hard work gone into these on their behalf. A really great conversation. And over 100 participants in combination of the events at the first and second workshops both. As well as a lot of online engagement in surveys, and then people visiting the website just to learn more about what this process is and some of the ideas that have been generated through it. So this is almost 2,500 unique visitors to the website just since October. So what are the things that we've heard, and what are the aspirations and concerns that have come out in this process? In the first survey, we asked lots of questions about the types of land use and development people would be interested in seeing, about the types of public realm, kind of a physical sense of place that people were interested in seeing, and then also unique destinations and the types of community benefits people would really want to see in something in order to consider supporting it. And so kind of organize some of this feedback into key themes then that shaped the land use alternatives we put together for the second workshop. What we heard as it relates to livability and natural systems is, what is, I'm certain, no surprise to those in the room, that there is division on student housing. Many people think that they would not like to see it here, and many others actually saying, we think this is an appropriate site given its proximity to campus. More generally, we did hear an interest in expanding housing options more generally, including for non-students, which is consistent with a lot of the feedback we heard in the strategic plan process. And then again, an interest in really thinking about unique gathering spaces, building on Abernathy Park, making that just a stellar, unique destination in the community. And so in each of these sections, key takeaways, we're describing here then how that's reflected in the land use scenarios that we developed, while also considering some of the feasibility considerations that we're trying to keep in our minds all the way along. So student housing is included in the alternatives as a pathway to make those community benefits feasible. And like Matt described, we really think this is kind of the option available to achieve some of those things related to a high-quality public realm, gathering spaces, destinations, and other strategic priorities for this site and elsewhere in the community. In every alternative, we really took care to cite the student housing and think about its density and location in a way that limits its impact, especially in terms of the experience in Abernathy Park and along Lake Hartwell, but also on College Avenue and on the neighborhood across Lake Hartwell and then to the east of College. And then, of course, incorporating new and different types of outdoor spaces in the types of alternatives that we propose. So what about vibrancy and the types of shared spaces that are included? So people were really interested in seeing a mix of unique destinations, so things that maybe don't have an analog or don't exist anywhere else in the Clemson community. How could those be made available in Uptown to make it a special place? A real interest in family-friendly places and spaces, managing traffic and access, of course, and then a concern about new retail space that's created, making sure that it doesn't sit vacant. And so how is that reflected in the land use alternatives? We have shown retail, though what we've shown is limited in terms of its square footage relative to the demand that we studied in the strategic plan process. And it's also connected to anchors that can help create sort of foot traffic to support other storefronts in the area. And Matt will describe what that means and looks like a little bit more in a second. Also taking every opportunity to make sure it's well connected to planned bike and pedestrian infrastructure and incorporating new parking, and then kind of putting forward specific ideas about institutional and cultural spaces for us to get folks' reactions. And finally, thinking about how, about the place's walkability and how well connected it is. So heard a lot about the importance of dedicated parking, but also pedestrian comfort and safety. And so you'll see in the alternatives significant new parking, but also wide sidewalks and a really high quality streetscape and a really high quality pedestrian environment integrated with natural systems. I'll say, and I think part of the conversation here that you'll see in economic feasibility is the opportunity to really generate enough value to pay for a very high standard of pedestrian environment. So, like I said, each of these three alternatives was guided by those same principles and responsive to the first public survey. They each have, slightly different approach to the combination of uses and the types of specific cultural and institutional destinations we're showing, and the approach to open space, but all share those same principles. in the second survey, and also at the second public workshop, we asked, of course, the important question of which alternatives community members would support. Which of the three, or maybe none of the three, would they like to see move forward? And so those who participated in the online survey, and we'll say that this reflected pretty closely the reaction we got during the public workshop as well. About 80% of respondents supported one of the three scenarios, where just 20% said, none of these, which to us indicated, a pretty broad openness to seeing something of this kind move forward, as long as the combination of uses is right, and that it is a really good deal in terms of community benefit within Uptown and this development's ability to advance other city initiatives and priorities. We also asked everybody to rate the types of gathering spaces and amenities that really stood out as important to them. And these were the top 8 of about 15 options that we put forward. So as you can see, outdoor dining and the idea of a nature playscape really jumped out as the top 2, as well as community plaza here third. A local foods market, also a lot of interest. And then some of these other things, declining interest, but still, a strong segment of the community interested in, say, an outdoor stage in Abernathy Park, an urban retail anchor that we'll describe, and some other types of kind of visitor destinations, like a cafe museum or a visitor center.
Great. Well, thanks, Miriam. And now I kind of want to walk you through some of these feasibility considerations. There are these 4 different lenses of market, community goals, of place and design, and economic feasibility. So we're going to save economic feasibility for last. It's kind of the primary focus of this, but we're going to do a little bit of review in each of these areas, because all 4 of these are really crucial to ensuring good quality development that serves the community well. And so, we know that, in most public meetings, I think people have a sense of what good place and design is. We spend a lot of time talking about community goals. Market support gets interesting, because as we're going to share with you, sometimes there's market support for something or demand, but the economics aren't good. That is going to play out in a couple instances at this particular site because the land's so expensive. But I'm going to walk you through this, because you'll really see how all 4 of these pieces come into play. So we'll start out with market support, and we did some analysis both during the strategic plan effort, and here again in a little more detailed way for this site. But we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but wanted to share with you in terms of scale how much demand there is or is not for different uses. So, we looked at retail, because so many people have said, hey, we'd like to see more active storefronts. That creates a lot of vibrancy in a Main Street environment. And so we looked at that. We looked at office, and we also looked at student and non-student housing. And, the reality is there's a very limited amount of retail and office demand. That's why you'll see in a lot of our scenarios, we're looking for places to strategically locate, retail or office at key corners to try to activate parts of a block, but you won't see it throughout the design. Now, one thing our analysis also showed is there are opportunities to increase retail and storefront demand, but it's going to require doing some things, creating a business district that markets, getting some retail anchors. So you're going to see some of those things as part of the strategy to try to increase that. What you'll also see is a lot of demand for student housing and a lot of demand for non-student housing. The difference is And you can see how relative to these other uses, how great that demand is. The difference between student housing and non-student housing is the student housing, because it can achieve much higher rents, it's economically viable. A developer can afford the land prices, or an investor can. The non-student housing doesn't economically work on its own. It would require some kind of subsidy. And we've got some strategy we can share with you, some ways that could be actualized, but it doesn't work in the same way that student housing does at these sites where land values are about as high as they are. Really, they're at their highest in the Clemson area. Next slide, Miriam. Community goals. Miriam shared with you a lot of what we heard from the community for this Uptown effort, and I just want to take a step back in 3 slides and talk about a little bit of the strategic plan, which was really about how to address growth, kind of identify that growth is going to continue. How do you want to address it? Talked about resiliency. We talked about inclusivity. And this site and a lot of this conversation is really on that place and quality of life and how it pertains to growth and how that plays out in land use development. So it's not to the exclusion of these other elements. It's just this piece really fit in the strategic plan as it pertained to those 5 catalyst sites and how to best develop or redevelop them in ways that are contributive to quality of life and the economy of the place and the community. Next slide. Right, and so those are those, just a little review, those are those 5 sites that we identified. And this is the big one with the most land area. Next slide. And just a little refresher from the strategic plan. What we did was really identify 4 broad goals: place and character, economic adaptation, city identity, housing options. And each of those had specific objectives to achieve. And what we did was we identified a number of infill sites and also some sites and areas on the edge of your community. And, you know, one of the mistakes communities make often is trying to accomplish every objective with a single site or area. What we want to do is really show how you could, as a community, achieve all of these objectives, really by taking what the place and the market would allow at each individual site. So for this Uptown area, the idea was to check a lot of boxes as it pertained to economic adaptation, but also focus on place and city identity, enhancing lake access, for example, locating people and housing and density where there's potential for transit connectivity, and really focusing some of those, student housing and, relatively denser non-student housing options in this among a couple of other places. Next slide. So that's really what you'll see are really, in this area, kind of the major goals that would be addressed or objectives are addressing student housing, cultivating development of catalyst areas, really creating a high-quality place in a handful of areas through redevelopment in a handful of existing commercial areas. And that's how, this site kind of fits into this overall puzzle from the strategic plan. Next slide. So provide just a little bit on place, and then we'll get into the economic feasibility. This was kind of the framework that we laid out for what would create a really great quality of place in Uptown. Creating walkability, a sense of vibrancy. I define vibrancy as places where you see people actively using sidewalk environments, where you see people outside of their cars. That's a place of vibrancy. To create shared spaces, to make it welcoming and connected, both with transit to the place and bike facilities to Uptown, but also creating better connections within the development, enhancing natural systems, daylighting creeks, creating contributing better to the environment and natural environment, and using that as an amenity, and really making it livable, adding housing to this place. Next slide. And what we're looking at today, there's some really great viable businesses in this area, but it's not connected, it's not beautiful, it's not a place that people want to walk around, or even can in many instances. This was an area, through no one's fault of anybody here, but was designed in a different era, very much with the automobile in mind, almost to the exclusion of pedestrians, and was designed in a site-by-site way, not as a bigger assemblage, so that's why it's not connected, and that's very much why what you'll see being proposed in this plan is something that is enabled through a larger assemblage and master development. Next slide. These were the three broad alternatives that we presented. As Miriam said, there was, between the three of these design alternatives, there was, about, I think, 78-80% support for one of these three. And, they're kind of variations of a similar theme. We've refined them a bit with some of our thinking since then, and some of our understanding, but really really need to get some of your feedback on some of the ideas that we'll put in front of you tonight. Next slide. And so, this was one alternative, and really an effort to address quality of place, and I'll just walk you through a few of these elements on the next set of slides. So you can see one of the things in all these scenarios, we tried to create some kind of walkable block size, which studied kind of like the ideal sizes for blocks for both development, but also for, creating a district, creating that district feel that makes people excited about walking around. And it's one thing to create places for people to park. It's another thing to give them reasons to park once, so they can walk around. And all of this has a positive impact on traffic. Getting people to, if they are going to drive, get them to drive once and then park. So really a lot of emphasis on creating those wide sidewalks. Outdoor dining was the #1 priority for amenities that people mentioned. So I'm going to create a lot of those opportunities. Next slide. Wanted to really create an opportunity for a retail anchor. One of the things that so many people said they want, that's the sort of vibrant, active ground floor retail uses, and one of the best things you can do is create something that brings people in, some kind of anchor, a grocery store, a junior Target, and we know from the work we do that corner, that Tiger Boulevard visibility is helpful, but really having it at that corner of College and Tiger means this is an opportunity to start to try to turn the corner for retail, get it to invite it into some storefronts down on College, instead of where most of your retail is located today, which is, of course, on Tiger. Next slide. And then really, none of our scenarios lack student housing. They all have a significant amount of student housing. What we've tried to do is find ways to put it internal to the site, to kind of preserve largely the park as park space, and to expand on that in the lake, to really put some focus on College Avenue with retail and things that'll benefit retail storefronts, and really kind of looking at doing those parking garages, the student housing that really pays for everything else, more internal to the site, and importantly, removing, I think, something like 13 curb cuts, really trying to remove a number of turning motions on Tiger, getting people to, probably with a traffic signal, to turn onto these roads that are internal to the site, getting those cars off Tiger as soon as possible. So not eliminating traffic, but getting it off of those main roads as much as possible, and getting people to park once and walk. Next slide. And then, really trying to identify and focus some amenities, expand upon the green space around the park, and again, create some amenities that new development could help fund. Things like an amphitheater were pretty popular. That nature playscape could occur. That was very popular. Some of that creek daylighting that could lead, frankly, from College Avenue all the way to Abernathy and to Lake Hartwell. We've seen this being done in some other communities, and it's great for the environment, but it's also a great public amenity. Next slide. So with that, we're going to get into economic feasibility. As I said, we've analyzed a lot of the numbers and want to kind of walk you through that. So when we're talking about economic feasibility, again, it's different from market. It's related to it in terms of, when there's market analysis, we know how much rent or revenue something generates, but feasibility really takes into account the cost side of the equation. What is the cost of construction? What's the cost of land? What are lending and risk assumptions? How much parking is required? And all of these things. There's their environmental remediation. Their new infrastructure that's needed. All of this contributes to cost. It can take, an idea for which there's demand or development for which there's demand, and it can make it less feasible or what we would say infeasible. So we've taken a look at different development alternatives and scenarios and analyzed it for all of this. Next slide. So at its simplest, this is what we're talking about. There's scenario A, and this is a feasible project. This is one in which the cost of development, when we think about, labor costs and building costs, it has a certain cost, and it also has a certain market value when we look at the rents or the sale prices. And if that market value is equal to the development cost, then you have a feasible, viable project. If the value is less than what it costs, it's infeasible. There's a gap. It's not fundable, generally speaking. So these are two alternatives, and we're going to share with you a couple of other shades of gray in this conversation. Next slide, Miriam. So, and by that, what I mean about those other two shades is this. So what we're going to do, we're going to share some different components of this one development scenario, and we're going to show you conceptually whether it's feasible or not. So you see that bar on the right-hand side, and there's red and yellow and gray and green. So if something is gray, that means it's feasible. It's the market value of it, construction costs are basically equal, and this would be a fundable project. If it's green, it means it generates a surplus. In other words, not only could you do the development, but there would be a surplus of money to then add amenity to a project. If it's yellow, it's not quite feasible, but it could be. A lot of communities will choose to participate using a tool like tax increment financing or something like that to push this not quite feasible project into feasibility. And they will do that when they see a public benefit that is meaningful to them and helps them achieve their goals. That's the only reason to do that, to partner on something. And then there's things that show up in the red, which are they're just not feasible, they're not viable, they're not even close, and no amount of partnership is going to change that equation. So we're going to kind of walk through some different components of this, and really the important thing, the big takeaway we want for you all is to see that there's trade-offs, to see that there's some things that generate a surplus of revenue that can help pay for other things. There's other things that are money losers in a privately financeable scenario, but maybe have value to you as a community. And because what you're going to see is some scenarios that generate a surplus, and we'll talk about some of the community goals. We put some cost to some of those things that could be funded through some of the different development scenarios the more profitable development scenarios that we'll share with you. And so we want to put all this in front of you to really put you in the best decision-making place in which you're seeing the development, but you're also understanding the numbers and the trade-offs so that you can think about it and give us direction on how you want to proceed. So next slide, Miriam. So this is just one corner of the development. This is, you know, the kind of entrance, really your entrance and gateway from your busiest street, Tiger Boulevard, to your main street, College Avenue. And so this is a site that we're showing some kind of community anchor, also some structured parking behind it to serve that, and some student housing on top. And you also see a really large public plaza kind of at the entrance, maybe with some gateway signage, well planted with street trees, some outdoor dining right as you enter the you know, this main street, to really give you know, really to welcome people and create an immediate sense of vibrancy and say, hey, you've entered the heart of the city of Clemson. And so this area in and of itself is kind of in that yellow. It's not economically feasible on its own. Anchor retail rarely is. And that plaza and that structured parking all have costs that exceed the revenue that essentially that the retail and that small amount of, relatively small amount of student housing generate on this site alone. But if we go to the next area, now you can see that area that's a little more internal. It's denser student housing. It's primarily student housing, plus some structured parking. Well, frankly, a lot of structured parking, and some amount of retail and office. And this generates a surplus. Okay, this generates a lot of revenue. This is from the private finance. If I'm a private developer and I'm developing this whole thing, I've got a surplus that I could work with you on. And say, okay, there's a surplus here. What are your priorities? What do we want to spend it on in terms of amenity for this development? We'll talk about what some of those could be. Next slide. Again, continuing that thought along Tiger and looking at another potential site for, could be student housing, could also be a hospitality site. Either way, it generates a significant amount of revenue, and again creates a surplus. So these are those past two sites we showed you are the big revenue generators. They're the engine that could pay for a lot of community benefit. Next slide. Conversely, what we showed on because we heard there was a desire to have a mix of, you know, if there's going to be student, we'd also like to have non-student housing, and so we drew that out here, and we drew non-student housing kind of facing the lake. We did some non-student housing on the southern portion of this kind of triangle, and it's not feasible. It can't happen on its own. The ground is too expensive relative to the rents that are achievable. However, it is one of the things that you could leverage the surplus that the student housing generates to help underwrite and make this viable. So that's absolutely possible that you could make the whole project in its totality viable, but you would have to spend a significant amount of the surplus to make this happen. Next slide. So that is a way in which, you know, you could take this northern area of the development, which generally creates a sizable surplus, 10 acres of development. If we look at this as a master plan development, and then if we went to if we look at the whole development, the project overall works, and there is still some surplus to do some other things with it. So we want to talk to you about that. So can we go to the next slide, Miriam? So the way it would work, you know, we've looked at the numbers, and in terms of magnitude, there's two kinds of revenue that this project would generate. One is a project surplus. So again, that's let's say I'm the master developer, and I've assembled this whole site, and we're doing, you know, student housing in these areas, and it generates a project surplus. There's also fiscal revenue that this is going to generate. The project surplus is probably on the order of magnitude about twice the size of what the fiscal revenue is, but in total, there's a lot of money created, a larger amount that could be used for site-specific, project-specific things, and depending on how you want to structure it, perhaps some off-site or community benefits too through tools like impact fees or deal structuring. But then there's also this fiscal revenue, which is fairly sizable, that could be used, community-wide at your discretion for community priorities, some of which we identified in the strategic plan. Next slide. So this is that conversation about trade-offs. Nobody's excited about student housing, but we've tried to create a plan that addresses the reality of it, puts it in the places where it's going to have relatively less negative impacts on your community, tried to put more of it internal in the scenario we shared with you. And let's talk about some of the uses, if you will, of funding. So we just listed some of the priorities in that kind of darker blue for project aspirations. These are things that came up in the public meetings, amenity that a lot of which Miriam shared in the public meeting. We also have this lighter blue amount. These are things that came up in many cases in the strategic plan, and some of these are more citywide efforts or on some of our priorities that you all had identified. And so, just a short list of those, like on-site, we could be talking about paying for things like that, creek restoration, helping underwrite some of that non-student or workforce housing, the nature playscape, investments in Abernathy Park and the expansion of it, and yes, new roads and a high-quality internal streetscape on all those internal streets that would get developed. So those are things that that surplus could fund, but there's also strategic priorities for the overall community. Workforce housing fund, very important priority that came out of our strategic plan. Another element that came out of the strategic plan, we're doing some neighborhood plans, and you could create revenue that could fund not just the planning effort, but some capital improvements that come out of that. So you could actually do some plans in some communities that have been, underinvested in or suffered from disinvestment, and really think and really do a plan and say, hey, we're not just doing a plan, we've got some funds to invest, and let's work with you all to figure out what your priorities are. There's the College Avenue bike and pedestrian, investments. Investments in the Green Crescent Trail, Tiger Streetscape. All of this adds to on both sides, adds up to a large sum of money. This will not pay for all of that, but it certainly could pay for a lot of on-site improvements. You could choose to pay, to do all of those, or you could do several of them and retain some of those funds and structure a deal so that you can fund some of these other elements, along with using some of that added fiscal revenue for those. So next slide. We broke it down a little further. These are things we want to share with you all. We put some, again, these are all order of magnitude costs, and I have to tell you, people that do cost estimation, construction cost estimation for a living will tell you it's never been harder to estimate these things than it is right now, but we've made our best effort to make some good order of magnitude estimates for the cost of amenities on the project aspirations, but we didn't want to lose sight of some of those strategic aspirations and priorities that came out of the strategic plan, right? So we put dollar amounts to these things, and right now, with our analysis, it appears that by virtue of doing assembled, high-quality development that includes dense student housing, there's an opportunity to pay for a lot of these aspirations, project aspirations, and there's also revenue to contribute toward these other strategic priorities. So, again, there isn't another site that we've identified in your community that can generate the kind of revenue that what we've put in front of you could. And so there is an opportunity to pay for a lot of these things and, create a real district in the center of your community. Next slide. as we started working, we wanted to share with you one other scenario. And this is what we mean when we say we need to, we want to put things in front of you and get some direction. So there's a lot to talk about on that previous slide and priorities. We want to give that to you. We want you all to be able to, we want to talk about it here. We want you all to be able to think about it. We can meet again and talk about this. Another scenario that we want to share with you is one that zooms out a little bit more, looks at both the east and west side of college. And another scenario could be doing almost entirely student housing along with mixed-use development in that triangle. That would generate even more revenue and focus the non-student housing uses, including and especially, I say non-student uses, including especially non-student housing, and really focus that on the east side. This is not dissimilar to what we're implementing, and the city of Blacksburg or town of Blacksburg's implementing right now, in which they said, let's create kind of a line on our main street and say, hey, this area that doesn't touch any of our neighborhoods, we'll focus the student housing there, but then leverage some of that excess revenue to help underwrite that non-student housing and some of those uses, make those property owners whole on the other side of the street, but make it targeting our workforce, non-students, and just really have that emphasis on that side on the east side of the street. So this is a scenario that actually creates much more revenue than what we just talked about. It would help fund relatively more strategic priorities in the community. It actually could be part of a funding mechanism for the east side of Maine and non-student funding. So that was not something we put in front of that was not something that we had contemplated or came up with as a scenario earlier. It's something that's come up subsequent to all of this as we were talking about and working through some of these scenarios. So wanted to share that with you as well. And I think next slide, Miriam. I feel like we've put a lot in front of you to talk about. So I just want to kind of summarize this for a second. And then kind of go to a pause so you all can talk, because again, sharing a lot of information, but that summary, there's market support for several uses, primarily for housing, but when we go to economic feasibility, it's the student housing that's not only viable but has the potential to generate a surplus. There is demand for non-student housing, but we've got to figure out some funding mechanism to make it possible. Other uses, retail and office, are limited. Hospitality is viable, but a limited amount of land use. What you're seeing is a plan that would, create a street grid, create meaningful public space, enhance natural systems, remove curb cuts, and achieve a lot of community goals in the process. So what you don't see is something devoid of student housing by any means, and I want to be upfront about that. But you do see something that addresses that student housing demand and that reality of it, and seeks to harness it in a planned way that minimizes some of its worst impacts and creates resources to do things that we understand to be community priorities. So I think with that, we're gonna pause. There's another component to this in which we'll talk about next steps, but we felt like at this point we knew we'd be putting a lot of information in front of you, and want to give you an opportunity to process that and share your initial thoughts.
Matt, did you have any reason that you have the scenarios outlined for B and C as well?
Yeah, we what we wanted to do here is kind of run some numbers for one concept, really more to emphasize the kind of trade-offs we wanted to understand for ourselves, so we could share with you all, how the economics are playing out for these different uses. But yeah, certainly that's a great point. We want to keep on the table and in the conversation, the other two alternatives as well. I think what we'd like is to get some direction from you all on some of these things and some of the trade-offs, and work through not only that, but those three scenarios, and try to come up with a preferred alternative that kind of unifies the thinking and thoughts that are most supported from you. So, yeah, appreciate you bringing that up. This is one scenario that we're sharing. There's different permutations. We really wanted to just kind of share one that get you thinking about trade-offs, and we can certainly invite other elements from those other plans in as we move forward to create a refined alternative.
So, thank you for that presentation. A couple of things. I think actually there is a fourth alternative, right? The fourth alternative is to not build student housing. Now, I know what that means, right? That means we won't have the trade-offs. But I think if your analysis was done more as a conjoint analysis as opposed to an absolute analysis, in other words, are you willing to give up this to not have this? I think there'd be lots of people who would say we would want to give up student housing and not do the trade-offs. What you've designed is exactly the reason people want a moratorium, to think about, is this the best thing for Clemson? So I don't agree with you that there's not a fourth option, right? It might be costly in terms of trade-offs, but I can tell you, and I don't talk to the same group of people as others, but not a single person who contacted me supports housing, even if that meant not doing a lot of the other things. So I don't know that that's not I don't agree with taking that off the table. I think that's an option. It means we don't do things. The other thing is, the 22% of people who said do nothing, I don't remember that actually was an option on the survey, and you might correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was an option. So I think 22% said that without it actually being a choice. And my guess is a bit higher if that was a choice. What we had was a real Hobson's choice. These are all unfavorable options, but you have to pick one. So I think the 22% is a remarkably high response for a response that I don't think, and tell me if I'm wrong, Matt, but I don't think was actually a response from the survey. So I like what you did. I like the analysis. I think you laid out clear paths, but I still think there is a fourth option, which seems to be what many people favor. I think probably other people on the panel have heard from other people, so they probably have not heard what I've heard, which is great. But I like to keep that on the table as the trade-off, as you so nicely used the word, would be we might not do some of these other things. I just think that in some ways people's opinion is that if we move the downtown the way that you're suggesting, all that really does is extend College Avenue all the way out to 123, and lots of local people won't go to that area even if you put the wonderful things you're suggesting in there, except maybe in the summer. That's an opinion, no data, but many people have told me that. They'll go to Pendleton, they'll go to Easley, they'll go to Greenville. So I don't know that this moves us forward. I like to see more. I also request before the next presentation, if you can actually send us the data and the analysis, not just your interpretation of that, because things like almost even, a whole lot more, I prefer to see that for myself. So please, I don't mean the data, I mean the final analysis. I don't want to see all the data, but so I understand these numbers when you present them. Did you disaggregate these numbers? Did you look by subgroups, for instance, at who answered in what ways? I'd like to see that. I know you got background data, if I remember. I think it's important to look at data not just in totality, but for subgroups that might be illustrative of other opinions. So anyway, appreciate this. It was really good. It helped me a lot. I still think there is a fourth alternative, but I'd like to see sort of the data analysis in total before we move on. I don't know what the next step is, but anyway, that's my thought on it.
I think,
Before John, Matt, did you want to respond? Did you want to respond to what Frank?
Just lightly on two things. One, we're happy to make more of the survey data available. I think that's very easy for us to do, and you want to acknowledge this is a brief summary of all of that. So happy to make that, and also want to acknowledge you're absolutely right. A do nothing scenario in any strategic exercise is a real scenario. I mean, that's absolutely that's a great point, and that's something to consider. I think this is these are scenarios that involve doing something, and that do nothing scenario always exists as an option as well. So want to acknowledge that for sure. So
I just want
thank
to
you.
add real quickly the question about the survey. In the first survey, we actually didn't have a none of these option, and many people let us know they would have preferred to take that. So in the second survey, we really took that point to heart and did include that. So the none of these point that you saw there, that does reflect that number of people kind of choosing the none of these rather than having an open-ended comment where they made that remark. But it's true in the first survey we didn't have that option, so we appreciated that critique.
I mean, it gets down to it's all about the money. And I mean, truthfully, the examples they've shown in the generation of income off of fees, et cetera, through the development or the building of the student housing, I think gets us to that point. I don't think that's the point we wanted to get to because we had to get there from a financial standpoint. I think we as a council are going to have to sit down and figure out, are there ways for us to be financial contributors in a way that some of the aspects of these plans could happen. But I mean, again, the city's going to have skin in the game. The citizens are going to have skin in the game. And we're going to have to all embrace that. When we get down to student housing, and I agree with you on that. I mean, we've heard time and time again about student housing, too many, whatever. But I mean, so the irony of this is I threw in numbers very similar to what Matt and Miriam put in their slides and everything. But with those numbers and with everything that's online and coming online, we'll be approaching 39,000 beds in and around Clemson. Not just in Clemson, but in and around Clemson. And I mean, I've seen numbers where the student body is to be in 5 years, 32,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. So at that point, you'd be even looking at a 5,000 bed excess. And I'm not saying that that's going to stop anybody one way or the other, because I mean, I know that, whether it's David's crowd or whoever, they intend to build student housing that will obviously draw the students to them at the expense of other projects that are around the area and all. So I know that's something we've all got to kind of come to grips with. But I mean, if we think that we need student housing because we need student housing, I don't think that's the answer. I think student housing is because the property owners feel like that's their best way to go, and I clearly understand that. I do. But I mean, if we don't get in here from a financial perspective and really get involved with this situation, the owners at this stage of the game are going to move forward with the project as they can within how we've got it set up at this stage of the game, and they're going to do what they want to do. And we would have wasted 2 years and this amount of money, and I don't think we want to go down that route either.
I'm going to stick to numbers for right now because that's what I do best. If you look at, I'm curious, Matt, and I know I gave you a really hard time at the meeting at the Arts Commission because I never agree with just presenting the positive side of that. And what this presentation did was only present the Lake Wobegon perspective. Higher education enrollment has decreased for the 7th year in a row. And yes, Clemson is wonderful. The Southeast is wonderful. The Charlotte-Atlanta corridor, as Matt kept reminding me, is growing. But that doesn't mean that higher education enrollment is going to grow. Even if, so I will share this with anybody who wants to see it, is if the university undergraduate enrollment increases and the graduate enrollment increases, you can play with all these numbers all you want, even at their current rate, that we will still have an excess of housing even out to fall of 2027. And that's an excess, by my conservative estimates, of 16,000 beds by fall 2027. You can see all the assumptions in here. And so, Matt, I don't know where you guys got your numbers, and the other concern is it going to be for luxury student housing? As our state ranks 8th in student debt, that's part of the reason parents are choosing other options. So I'm curious about what kind of community, I agree with John, what kind of community we want to become, and what do we see as downtown? Because what Matt said to me at one of the meetings was, well, people will come downtown and that's where the new developments are, so that's where students will be. Well, great, so then we have property owners who have already invested their time and their energy and their money in other areas, and so we're going to be losing their money because they're not going to have successful developments. So we have to, John's right, we have to arrive at a balance with this. And lastly, and then I'll be quiet, is what I heard from residents was that these choices, and I admit I was surprised, Matt and guys, when I took the survey, I expected like A, B, and C to be different. And I heard more people, including myself, say, how are these really measurably different developments? You're asking us what Fran said, it's a false choice. Do I like this architecture or this architecture? Do I like 4 stories or 5 stories? That I don't think is what residents expected. And so I don't see how we can continue just to pretend that everything is going to be positive. I admit I always like to look at the flip side of things, and that's what I'm looking at right now.
So, a couple things, outside the city limits, that's fine. And in a certain way, we've got to think about ourselves. And while there's housing outside the city limits, we still do get all of those problems and issues that come with it with zero revenue. So we've got to keep that in mind. Number one, we are talking about a different type of demand. And yes, there are always winners and losers in any market. And within our market, while some of those things, you say people put their time and money, I'm going around in my head around the city and thinking through our stock of student housing. And some of that, and a lot of it, is at the end of a life cycle. Some of it is well past the end of its life cycle, that potentially by moving the demand elsewhere, we can possibly open up other alternatives in the market for some of the things that we're looking at in affordable and workforce housing, and some of those areas being converted to that. Demand is very complex in what, again, there's going to be gives and takes and push and pull in what that demand creates. And while, there are things outside the city, but again, we're going to inherit all of those issues with no income. To Fran's point about nothing happening, well, absolutely something can happen currently on this site and any site throughout the city. And if we look at this triangle with our current zoning that we just passed, that could become one massive, if someone would assemble it, property line to property line to property line, 3-story building that sprawls across the entire area. We would still get it, and we would get a way worse product than what we can get by thoughtful development. And the task that we gave the consultants was to come up with the balance, as they said in the beginning, of economically viable and potentially implementable. And while I certainly hear both sides of the story, I hear from a lot of people that they expect, maybe they don't completely like it, but they understand that we are going to grow and change and evolve, and people are looking for things like in the gives and takes, like the Green Crescent Trail and walkable communities, and are absolutely willing to see a different level, a different type, particularly if we're more thoughtful and coherent with development moving forward, for those things to happen. We saw some examples. If you create the right environment this year with our downtown events and those kind of things, that if you create the right environment, do the right things, people will come and we'll get those interactions. So again, I think we've been presented with, particularly in option A and the first one there, at the very least, the holistic view, we're seeing mixed use, whereas previously we were seeing student housing only with empty retail happening everywhere. Here we've actually got a true use, mixed use development in our mixed CM district, which to me is a great improvement over the arc of where we were going.
Is this the one you wanted, Bob?
No, this is not the one that I wanted. This is not the one that I like the best of all of them. And there's things about all of them that I like, and there's things about all of them that I don't like.
Before we go, Matt and Mary, sorry, did y'all want to respond to anything? And then I know John, Alicia, did y'all want to? You don't have to. I'm just giving you the opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we'd like to just, continue to hear from everyone. but we are taking notes and probably will want to respond to a few things. But yeah, I'd like to continue to hear from folks if you all have more to share.
Okay, sounds good.
I think all of you all made some very valid points. That's the question I have in looking at this. The different options. One of my concerns is I realize that there is going to be some needs for student housing, so we're not naive to believe that that's not the case. The question I have though is, does it have to be at the level that we're talking about in these different options? Because if we do have the trade-offs, my question is, who are our primary target audience, or who are we trying to work with? Because once again, I know it's pie in the sky, but depending on where you get your numbers from, that enrollment fee number is not just main campus. That's the entire enrollment. So that could be individuals who are online, that's distance learning, that's also those who are taking classes in Greenville, live in Greenville, also Charleston. We open up different campuses all across the South Carolina area. So we're not talking 32,000 here necessarily. So those numbers are skewed when we talk about the numbers in terms of our revenue. Now, we can't predict the future, but to Catherine's point, it's very possible things can change. Where people may not necessarily want to come to a four-year institution because you're finding ways that individuals are making do without actually going, although Clemson is still doing real well, but that can change. So my thoughts are, the amenities that we're talking about, what we do not have, is there any way, to Fran's point, to come up with another option that does not have as much density in terms of their student housing, but could also talk about some of those rich uses? Because that's what I guess I was hoping to see, is to see, because I think I wrote it down where you all talked about their vision on the student housing and some of the stuff that you heard, but it looks like the vibrancy and shade and shared spaces, it seems to be that's what the most interest was from the individuals who provided their feedback. But is there not a way to provide us an option, taking into account that there needs to be student housing, but not to the level that we have in these different options that we have, keeping in mind some of the things we're talking about with the mixed use. I would think are more of a priority right now than student housing, because we have it's here. We have, to Catherine's point, surplus. We have the different developments going up. So if we start investing, or the developers start investing, will we realistically be able to provide what we're talking about? That could be 20, 30, 40 years, and we still won't get to that point. So we would have done this exercise and still not provide some of those things that our community needs and wants. So for me, I would like to see less density and a little bit more of the other uses being an option, to see if that would also be something that the community versus what we have right here.
Yeah, I guess a little bit of it is just kind of getting behind the numbers and seeing what that trade-off is. I probably disagree with Fran on the absolute nothing. We've had this conversation on other topics. I don't believe in absolutes for anything. So doing nothing is an absolute. It doesn't work for me. And John says behind the, it comes down to revenue at some point. And I agree. And, skin in the game from citizens actually may mean giving up a little bit of their desire to not have student housing. Their skin in the game may come from accepting that we're going to have more of that than we won't, because we're looking at Green Crescent Trail. We're looking at expanding Nettles Park. We're talking about we don't have enough room at Central Clemson Rec. We're looking at future growth for the Arts Center, for the African American Museum. I mean, you look at what we have, a need to grow a police force, things that, quite frankly, we can't afford to do at the levels we want to come close to it right now. So when you look at an area like this, I don't see how you move forward out a significant level of student housing. I don't feel like it's our job to pick winners and losers. People are going to live closer to campus. The outskirts may have a little bit of a challenge with that, but I think that'll fill in. And I think when you're looking at student housing, I'd be curious to know as we focus solely on Clemson, and that is the drive, and I think it's the land grant institution. I think there's a lot of things to say that they will hold up to enrollment better than some of the rest of higher ed, but at the same time, what else goes into this housing as well? If you infill with some students here more, do you have a little more of your workforce, your Tri-County, your suite of other ones kind of filling in some of these other beds to the outside, because we're not operating in a vacuum here. So I think have to take a little deeper dive into what else may go in, and that goes beyond our scope, because I feel like what we're looking at is Clemson students, but everybody's concerned about what we're going to pull from other areas, so just kind of keep that in mind. And probably a little more definement of what we call non-student housing downtown. Conversation I have with people a lot of times is that we get the reputation as a college town, because we are, but we're a retirement community. Look around here. I mean, there's a lot of retirees moving. There's a lot of people that buy second homes that are coming in to future retire. There's people that lived in Chapin and other areas like that to move up here. But I make that point because we're talking about this non-student housing downtown, and I think I'm very guilty of this anyway. Y'all may not be, but I look at it and listen. Do I want to live downtown? Probably not, because I'm kind of used to living out. But older people coming in with a second home, this walkability, these different things, I think that would be very important to them. So I do think from an expectation setting bar and from a viability, we probably need to color in a little bit more about what the non-student, component looks like. I just think there's maybe a little more breadth there. And then it gets back to the numbers. I can probably get with Andy. I'm kind of, the banker in me maybe wants to, I appreciate the numbers y'all put in there, man. I probably want to drill a little bit deeper on them.
There's two of us there.
Well, it's just a part of me. I can't speak for you, but it sounds like there may be two of us that want to meet with Andy, and or 2.5 counting John. He's retired. Yeah. Well, but kind of work through that. Anyway, I'll be quiet and let somebody else talk.
Let me just make maybe 2 comments. I mean, so the assumption I think we're making seems to be, though, we have to build with student housing downtown. We have other catalyst areas where we've talked about doing it, right? So I'm not so sure, particularly when we saw Catherine's document on demand, that every catalyst area has to have student housing. I think it's much more logical to not make that the locus of student housing as opposed to some of the other catalyst areas. And we've talked about that, and I know that was not the purpose of this project, all right? So I guess my first question to the development strategies is the housing that you're suggesting based on other housing in other catalyst areas, or is it absent from other areas' housing? Because if the only reason for student housing we can come up with is the economic money it generates, then maybe there are other places that are better than downtown, which we want to generate some other important things in terms of community identity and those things. So I don't know that it's a zero-sum game in that sense, that here or nowhere there's going to be winners and losers. So I would hope, and maybe you can get back to this with at some point, that this does not mean that is the place as opposed to other places. If we put student housing in other catalyst areas, we're probably going to meet this demand that doesn't seem to be so great. So maybe it's not either or, we don't do other things. Maybe there's alternate ways to find the money to do these things that don't include basically moving student housing to a place where it's least wanted by most people. I think that's a fair statement. Maybe it's not, everyone doesn't want it, but probably least want it. I think the other question, and Matt, I'm asking again, so in your calculations, did you look at the impact in terms of students moving from place A to place B? Because if place A is already in Clemson and they move to place B, place A has to close down or has reduced rents, how does that change the financial equation? Because that's just moving the money from one place to another without generating new money, right? It's moving it within the city of Clemson because we're losing housing, the money generated from housing in one place if students won't move out of there just to get it somewhere else. I don't know if we included either of those things, sort of the other places for student housing, and what happens to your financial model if the students moving into the new buildings actually are moving out of old buildings in Clemson already. What does that do in terms of we're generating, I guess, less money from the places they're vacating And again, I don't know if that adds up. Now, anyway, I think those are two variables that I think of. John, I didn't mean to say we don't want to do the trade-offs. We do. But is that the best way or the only way to do it? Or are there catalyst areas, maybe as you know, again, Alicia always brings a lot of light to the heat. Maybe it's really scaling down the housing in the downtown area, knowing the catalyst areas will have, you know, among myself, more support for student housing in those places. So anyway, I think both those factors, student housing in other places and reducing students in place A, but to place B, and A is already in Clemson, what does that do to the economic model? And I don't know if we look at that or not.
One thing.
I'm not saying we don't want to do that. I think we do. All of them.
So, Matt, Mary, do you want to answer Fran's question specifically?
Yeah, so I've got kind of two questions about, one of them gets at kind of, you know, why here, why student housing here, and why here relative to other catalyst areas, and then the other question really being about the idea of students move in greater number to this site. What does that mean for housing that they're you know, vacating kind of thing? So I want to take those. They're two separate, but maybe in some cases related questions, but I'll try to take them one by one at first. The thought about, you know, why here, again, so much of it has to do with the market dynamics at play here, which is about, again, it is more about demand for a product that is close to campus, that for which the rising affluence of the student body of Clemson and their parents can afford and will pay a premium for to be close to campus. And it is for this reason that you'll continue to see development proposals for all of the land and areas adjacent to campus and that are, I think, you know, commercially zoned, that are certainly within a mile and likely more so within half a mile of campus. So what we are saying is this is the place where there's an opportunity to build relatively more of that housing relatively closer to where the people are trying to get to, school. So from a planning model, the best place to put the most people is closest to where they're trying to get every day. That's the best for the environment. It's the least cost for your infrastructure and transit and all of those things. And in this instance, the demand is for the sites closer to campus, and there's a premium that is possible in terms of rents, and that gives the opportunity at this site, unlike other places, for a surplus to be created. And so I want to be clear with you all, that's part of the opportunity, that's part of the choice that you all have. You want to harness this site, not just for the economics, because what you see in front of you is a whole host of things that the development that and the plans that we put in front of you accomplishes, and economics is one piece of that, but also placemaking, also the ability to fund, yes, other strategic initiatives in your community, and not insignificantly address that market demand and that market pressure head on. In other words, meeting it somewhere so that you start to diminish those development proposals for that luxury student housing near campus. And what that's going to do is release or alleviate land speculation for commercial areas in other places that can start to lower the land cost in other places, making the development of workforce housing, which is important to this community, affordable housing, relatively more possible, because you've reduced or eliminated some of that land speculation. So it accomplishes a lot of things, what we're sharing with you. It's not just about creating revenue, but it does create revenue. And what we wanted to do, and the reason we wanted to zoom out and look at the whole community and look at the strategic plan, was to identify, yes, some of those other strategic priorities that you all have. And this is the place that would generate the most revenue for those things, yes. But it's also the place that has the most demand pressure. I also want to address, a comment from a few folks, and I want to be clear about this. There may be a path to doing lower density student housing on this site, but there won't be a surplus. And what that means is you won't get the other side. I want to be crystal clear about that. There's that office space and ground floor retail for mom and pops and all of that stuff. It is not possible. I do want to be clear about that. The economics do not allow for that at this site. So that's not going to be an alternative if you do nothing or wait and see. So what I do want to be, but there is a possibility you could create a scenario where there's less student housing density, you do student housing, but there isn't a surplus and it's not really mixed use at that point. So I want to be, it is fair. I think this really helps clarify some of the choices that you have. And that's what this master plan development scenario and set of scenarios, sub-scenarios is. The choices you all have of ways to address this demand, meet it, and harness it for public, for a maximum amount of public benefits and amenities. You obviously don't have to do any of this, but it is an opportunity to leverage that and create as much amenity as you can. Now, on the other thing, the concept of are people moving, what does this do to the market, of existing housing if people moved here, and what does that do to, housing that those folks are vacating and so on. And, it's a great conversation. We do housing strategies where we're just solely focused on housing for a region, for a city, and the takeaway that you want people to have is that housing has a whole ecosystem. So when you're building, when there's a lot of demand pent up for luxury housing, luxury student housing, and you build new, yes, folks are moving to there. And I want to be clear, it's not a zero-sum game. There are going to be more and more affluent kids and parents. So the demand is growing at a rate that is greater than the total number of people and students that we're talking about. But, yes, people will locate into that luxury housing. Some of your housing's older. Some of it's 30 years old, right? 40 years old, 50 years old. Some of it suffered from deferred maintenance. Some of it's very well maintained. All of it starts to find a place in an ecosystem of housing. Some of it becomes upscale housing, but not luxury. Some of it's mid-scale. Some of it's, relatively well maintained, but the rents don't grow over a period of 10 or 15 years the same way that luxury housing does, and it's affordable to students or parents that can't afford that luxury housing. So by moving into luxury housing, yes, it frees up other housing for other uses. It might, we're working in Gainesville, which is a much, relative to Clemson, a much bigger community. Some of that older generation housing is being repurposed for workforce housing. It's being reinvested in and reinvented for different uses because some of that luxury housing's been freed up. So I'd say, we taught classes on this. I mean, we could spend, happy to talk about this more, but I think at a high level, I'd just say, this luxury student housing would be it's part of an ecosystem. The housing, the demand for that luxury housing is going to increase at a number that is greater than overall housing growth. And I think there would be opportunities, certainly, to make a overall assessment of housing in your community and think about some other apartment properties standalone and larger professionally managed properties, and think about where they fit in an ecosystem. And again, part of what our strategic plan called for was the creation of, an affordable housing or workforce housing fund. And one of the best strategies we have in a lot of communities is to look for development of workforce and affordable housing. To serve the most people is to look at your existing housing stock and look at ways that it could be shored up with a fund so that it's quality affordable housing, not just affordable housing. And so, yeah, I think it's part of, I think, Fran, it's a great question, and it's a great part of what we hope you all can look at as part of the overall housing ecosystem. Everything impacts everything else. You're absolutely right about that. And what we're trying to do is put forth a set of strategies so that you can get out ahead of some of this in various ways and get the community benefit. Because so often we work in communities where development happens, they're reacting to it. It doesn't happen in a coordinated way, but it does happen. But all the benefit and the opportunity for the amenity and the benefit and contributing to funds that contribute to strategic goals, they don't happen in the coordinated way. That's what this is intended to do.
I just wanted to say the one thing, though. We got to this point from a moratorium perspective as a result of people wanting to do something special with that area. And quite frankly, that was one of the main drivers when we were out getting the petition signed, et cetera, was the fact that, this was a special place. We wanted it to be a destination. I do know that also there was, the fact that there may be some student housing in this project or this area. I don't think everybody's going to get overly upset about that. If it has to be a part of it to make it work, I think it does. But I know that in the discussions there, particularly as it fronted the lake, that, there was the consideration of some, in addition to some businesses or whatever the case may be, some very, very, very high-end housing that could go in there. One of the things you've got to understand about Clemson, I'm afraid that Clemson has become, or is becoming, this elitist town. And if you look at what's on the market right now and what's coming on the market right now and everything that's going to be developed right now, we're not talking about affordable housing. We're not talking about workforce housing. We are talking about upper-end housing is being planned to come into this community. So I think that it's very, very real that some portions of that property could be developed for non-students on a very, very high-end scale. But at the same time, yeah, I think there will have to be some student housing to go in there to help make it happen. Because I go back to what John said and what I've said also. We got a lot of things we want to do in this town, but for this thing to work like we want it to work, we're going to have to put some money in this. We're going to have to figure out a way to do it. And we're going to have to prioritize it. I mean, some of these other things that you rattled off a second ago, they may not be as high a priority as this may become the number one priority for this community. But again, this moratorium came about because people in this community wanted to do something very special with the last lakefront property that we had in this town.
And student housing. So we also want less student housing.
Right.
So, couple things. So, first of all, from the catalyst areas that have been identified and those kind of things, all of them have good locations. This is, I probably personally like the Clemson Crossing one the best as far as a catalyst area, but from a realistic standpoint, the ability to assemble those properties that are largely loaned one-off apartments over and over and over again is like insanely difficult. And that's the case in many of our other catalyst areas. Where this, we already have some assembly going on, they're bigger pieces of property that, and the location is still excellent, close to campus for student housing. Second, the moratorium that was put on was for 200 beds an acre, right? 200 beds an acre or higher.
200 plus.
200 plus. Both of these scenarios, even in scenario one, including the non-student housing, scenario one was 101 beds per acre. Scenario two is 124 beds per acre on a 14.6 acre site. And back to my point, with our new 3-story limit, we could end up with more beds per acre because developers and property owners are going to go as wide and as massive and as dense as they can on this site. And it's going to develop the entire 14.6 acres. There's not going to be a stitch of open area on it. They're still going to be rented to students and be student oriented in that case in particular. We are getting both of these, even the one with more student housing, which I don't like because I think John's point is very important. We can create something really special here that will draw people, the people that you say, well, I'm not going to go downtown. There's already not coming downtown. So if they don't come downtown to a new, different thing that's even more engaging we're not losing anything there. We still might gain. You still might win a fan or two by creating something special and different that will be an attractor to people. So I think, we're talking in these scenarios. In one case, half of what the moratorium stopped. So again, just looking at the yellow and going, oh, well, that's student housing and this number of beds. It's less, this could have happened under the moratorium. And again, doing it in a holistic way, in my opinion, is way better than letting it happen one-off and organically and only being student housing, which is the situation we were in, and potentially still could be with our baseline stuff eventually. That is what's most likely to happen there. So again, we have an ability to control.
How does this prevent someone from building what you described already?
Because we are going to create an overlay district and zoning rules and hopefully be able to work with a master developer that comes in on the front end. You make the deal and you say, this is what the master plan is, and then the master developer executes the master plan.
Well, we could have an overlay district that says you can't build any student housing. If we have the authority if we have the right to develop an overlay district that reduces the current size, we must have the right to reduce it to no student housing. So, right?
No, I don't think we can't say you can't have student housing because, and housing that's available to students. And people are going to go to what drives the market best. And right now, students will pay. If you let any housing go in there at all, which in a CM district, which we have, it's supposed to have mixed housing, commercial, and those kind of things. Housing, you develop any kind of housing there. We can't discriminate and say, well, students aren't allowed to rent or buy or live in this place. I don't think there is a legal way that we can go to that point.
Okay, but here's my question: I'm going to use the question a very wise woman asked me, which is that why is university housing problems our problem? There is nobody at the university who's sitting around spending the hours and the money that we've spent debating the issue of student housing. I'm not saying it's not a shared burden, but I'm concerned that in none of this is the university playing a part. The second question is, yeah, you tell me this is an overlay district and this is where we need to have this. And then how many months from now are we going to look at Clemson Crossing, which I agree with you, that seems like a better option. And for the record, guys, Matt and everybody, that is just as close to campus and more walkable, more bikeable than Uptown. So in 6 months or a year, are you going to be coming back here and saying, oh yeah, well, that wasn't enough money, it wasn't enough space, so now we're going to ask you to do this again. And that's my concern. We have 5 districts, I believe, in that strategic plan, and I think 3 of them are designated as primarily or a majority of student housing. And that's a lot when no one can tell me that there is demand. Nobody can.
And I guess I was going to ask the question Fran asked, what's the stop developers from doing it, if that's the case, but you answered that part. But my other question is, if there is such a high demand, and luxury apartments are what's in, why wouldn't they rent those apartments if they're at the other overlay districts? I mean, if there are no other options, and that's where they would have to go, what would stop that from happening? And then to Catherine's point, why is what said? Why is that an issue? Why are we the only entity at the table talking about housing for students if indeed the university is making that decision? So my question to Matt and this group is, how much discussions have you had with the university about these plans, because I don't see this as just the city of Clemson. I see this as the city of Clemson and the university, because the students are coming here because of the university, not because of the city of Clemson. And once again, our residents look to us to make sure that we, because I agree with you, John, there are things that we need to be able to finance. We have some big ticket items that's coming in. So maybe my naiveness, I'm trying to understand the difference between if you build for students or if you build for non-students. From tax purposes, where's, how does that differ? So I would need to see the difference, because if you have like units where people can buy condominiums, so to speak, or invest in that type of property, where those are non-students in that district, but it's actually appealing to people who are not students. That may be something that they're interested in, to your point of retirement. But we also have faculty members, we have young professionals, people who want to move, but they want to live in an environment where maybe they live in an apartment style environment. And to your point, Matt, they could have that retail, that anchor that you talk about, but they have those amenities, because that's what a lot of other communities are also doing in terms of those complex, high density complexes. So my question is, what would that look like? So it seems like we just focus on because it's their students, but from the bottom line, would that still provide us with some revenue if that's something we're looking at in terms of being able to provide needs and more particular?
It's just not without us subsidizing that on the front end. That's economically not feasible at the moment, because you're getting student beds, you're getting $1,000 to $1,200 per bed. So if you're, and I would assume, even when I was a young professional, I wouldn't have moved in necessarily with two other roommates paying $3,000 to $3,600 per month, because with $1,000 right now, you can go out and buy what, a $275,000 house, in Pendleton or somewhere else. So maybe by having some things closer to campus that are in that market, maybe some of the older product elsewhere gets redeveloped into something that is more attractive to young professional and workforce, where the land underneath it is not as valuable as the land is as you go out from campus a bit. So yeah, we could do that, but it would take a pretty significant public subsidy to set up the financial and economic environment where that could occur from us at the expense of our $100 million road, water, sewer, infrastructure problem, Green Crescent Trail, Nettles Park expansion, and all these other public goods that we could get by targeting and having development in a few key places that get you to the surplus to get that community benefit money as well, that might lead to the other benefits of redevelopment of existing properties that maybe are not being rented now by students. But the beauty is, Fran, your tax question and revenue question is, guess what? If no one's renting that building, somewhere else, they still get the tax bill based on our revenue does not go down, because they still get the tax bill based on the value of the last assessment. So it doesn't, again, it's winners and losers. People make that risk as they invest in those properties. Just like people taking risk to invest in these properties when you could do something significantly different with it that now we are trying to do in a different way.
I have to go to, maybe part of the solution, I think the answer would be we're going to have to make lots of compromises and lots of discussion. But maybe part of it is we return to our original plan that you actually developed, which is that if we're doing this overlay, that we make the overlay that becomes a PD district, in which case we continue to maintain some control of what happens to there. So maybe as we compromise now, the PD gives us at least some sense, the community some sense of what happens there, without prohibiting any population group, anything else. But if we're allowed to do overlay districts, I would be more comfortable with an overlay district that says PDs than CD, just because down the road there's some issues that I think the Planning Commission has some clear. So I think there are compromises, there are thoughts, there's ways to do this, but I think our first duty is not to the developers, it's not to Clemson University, it's to the people that live with us. And I think we have to figure out, John's point's well taken, maybe there are trade-offs people are willing to make. That's fine, I'm not deciding for anybody, but I think our first priority has to always be the people who live here and pay taxes, maybe less than the departments do, but anyway, so maybe PDs might be the route to go, maybe the better things we can think of. So
And I bet you right now, like Matt and Justin and Miriam are about to jump through the screen, because I think that's probably where they're looking to go in suggestions for how you do this with a master plan and an overlay. That again, the overlay and the master plan become the PD, and they say, if we say, if you're executing this, it's almost like a PD like you and I have talked about that has like an express lane. That if you're doing what's in the master plan and in the overlay, it's pretty automatic. If you come and say, I've got a different creative idea, there's a higher bar to get across to get to that.
All right, so I think that's a good segue. Matt, would you like to talk about next steps? Oh, John, did you?
Well, both of them.
Yeah,
I just had two
Oh, yeah.
quick
Oh, I'm
comments.
sorry, I missed that.
That's all right. One, just make sure when we remember we're talking about Clemson Crossing and other areas that we're talking about net bed gain, because we talk about them filling a big hole, but there's a lot of student housing in some of those areas already. So if our plan to revitalize things, like Bob pointed out, in this particular area, it would actually diminish the amount of student housing by doing this. Think about that when you think about Clemson Crossing and these other areas too, because it's maybe not just as simple as saying there's going to be 1,000 beds there. Well, if there's 983 already, you had made a big change. I don't know the numbers, but y'all. And on the university, bringing them to the table, talking about housing and solving their problems. I get that, and I've been on that bandwagon before, but there's a part of me too that just says, you know what? They're a large economic driver. You call it a different type of industry, and it's not students that are doing it. We probably have a little bit of a different feel for it, but also, and again, the market bears some of it out. There's probably more students who live on campus, but with the restrictions on gatherings, alcohol, other things, there is a reason that a lot of them don't want to be on campus. They are. I do think they need to be at the table, but I think maybe I feel like the conversation drifts towards them about them supplying housing, and maybe we need to kind of put the focus on transit or other investments they can make outside of housing, because they're a set size. I mean, we're small in geography, they're smaller in geography, they're growing different types of things. I just think that conversation maybe needs to kind of, and that may be everybody's intent to it already. I might just be slow to the party, but we might just need to me, I feel like that needs to be more of the emphasis on how we address them in those areas.
All good feedback. Now we'll go back to you, Matt. Next steps.
yeah, great. And just wanted to touch on a couple of things just to make sure I'm answering your questions. And it is a really nice segue to talk about implementation. I did want to say, as it pertains to, two things. One, as it pertains to university involvement, it's never been the position of this planning group, and certainly in the strategic plan, and that university can't and shouldn't do more to partner with the city. We wholeheartedly agree that they can and should. To John's point, we identified transit as a very important and necessary part of a partnership with them, and we identified a number of other things, small business growth and incubation. They could play an important role in that, and a number of things, but certainly agree that they could do more from our perspective, and should do more, and the strategic plan says that, and it was important to that to the committee that we were working with to say that in a very specific way. I also wanted to point out, yes, we did identify several areas to accommodate student housing demand, including Clemson Crossing. We were creating a plan to help the city. The strategic plan intended to help the city over a period of several years or decades, and so did identify several sites that could accommodate higher density demand. So from our perspective, I want to be clear on that. This site uptown and Clemson Crossing, they're not mutually exclusive. They're both play a role in that student housing ecosystem. So I just wanted to be clear about that. So again, I want to share with you all, because I do think it's a good segue to think about tools and how you might be able to move forward to talk about a little bit of the implementation process. So Miriam, if you could go to the next slide. One thing I wanted to do, I wanted to show you what some next steps could look like. Certainly we think, I want to acknowledge, I think there's definitely space and going to be a need to have another conversation. We want to let you all kind of take some of this information and digest it a bit, and I think there's going to be a need for another meeting where we get maybe into a little more specifics about direction. But when I get you all thinking about this, it's also fair to talk about this. Want to just bring this up first. This is a development framework, and want to talk about what that means, and I think it's certainly clear. Hopefully, if we're doing our job, it's clear to you all how this is different from a strategic plan, where we're looking at the, going from looking at the whole city to looking at a specific site. I want to talk about the difference between this and a master plan, and we can explain a little bit the process difference in a minute. But this is really a framework that sets forth a set of strategies. There is a physical plan, if you will. You're seeing buildings and streets and roads and all that. It's really an indication of how, the idea is that it's an indication of how development could be accomplished in a way that maximizes that community benefit, minimizes or mitigates some of the negative impacts, and it sends a signal, it gives a roadmap for a potential partner on the private side of development of how you would like to see things developed. But it's not an actual physical master plan. That would still have to come on the other side of the zoning overlay. So I wanted to, it's a distinction. I don't want to get too much into, I'm not intending to get into semantics, but I want to show you in the process diagram how these things play out and how they're a little bit different. This is kind of, there's a more detailed diagram, but this is kind of a simplified version of how, on a more complex development, and by complex I mean there's assembly, there's a master plan. You're trying to do coordinated development amongst multiple uses, public space, public right-of-way, private uses, all of that, how that might get coordinated, and how the steps that go from the plan, the community plan, we're creating a framework plan, to actual development. And the next phase, and it's such an important one, we call it the bridge phase. And that's where you really want to, and what you see here in the blue, you see what happens on the private side. In the green, you see what the private sector is doing, or could be doing. And so, that first phase is getting that regulatory environment in place. So that's where the zoning overlay comes in. It's so important to have that happen right, essentially immediately after a plan. And what you're doing is really protecting yourself. You're codifying what you want and don't want, with some specificity and some legality to it. And you want to have that in place before you either go and solicit a master plan developer, somebody who could work with you and partner with you and on the private side, and do some of that assembly to help achieve that vision. That's one approach that you could take, or you could create the regulation and which could require a minimum assembly. That's a key part of a potential overlay, is that there's a minimum land area assembly. So you're requiring, essentially, in order to get certain benefits, density, whatever it is, you're requiring that enough land is assembled so that something cohesive and coherent, that's consistent with the framework that we're laying out, could be accomplished. And so, on the other side of that, the private side, there's assembly. If you can go back one step, Miriam, just for a second, just to have the cleaner version. So the next step then would be then a developer, perhaps you've gone to RFP and it's a master developer, comes and then submits that master plan, right? So now this is the thing that they would be coming to you all for approval with. And there's certain things that can accomplish that the overlay can't. The overlay is the regulation, it's the legality, it's the indication of what you want, but the master plan is the design, right? You get into some of those more fine-grained details, a little more height over here, a little less here. We're indicating all of that in the framework plan. You're codifying that to a degree in the regulatory environment, but some of the beauty and the problem solving that comes from design is going to happen here, and that's where you get that kind of final opportunity for approval. Where something's got to be submitted that you as a council, planning commission approves. That's where that kind of happens. And we call that the vision alignment phase. Now, once you have a master plan that you've agreed on, now comes that deal structuring, and this is what's so important. So this is the part where you enter into an agreement. The developer, the development entity, elects to enter in an agreement with you all, and they specify what they're going to do. You specify what you're contributing, right? So this is where you get everybody talking about what they're going to contribute in a deal, and this is where it can become very possible to say in an agreement, hey, we're going to do student housing here, but we're going to do non-student housing here, and we're not going to rent it to non-students. This is why we got this question so often. How can you tell me these units aren't just going to get gobbled up by students too? It's this deal structure. It happened as part of an overall development agreement. It would be unlikely, a near certainty that somebody's not going to agree to that kind of restriction on a single site. But if you look at it as part of a whole development where some things are generating surplus, others are not, this is where this becomes a viable deal that, we've seen examples of this, and it is possible. This is also where, maybe the city says, hey, we're going to contribute this to the project, roads X and Y, and this is where the developer says, okay, we're going to contribute, this public space, and we're going to invest in this, and we're going to invest in streetscape. All those things, it all gets outlined here and bound. And then from there, you're going to pre-development. At this point now, you've got the master plan that you all have approved, the deal structure is in place, and now phases of development are going to happen where the developer's submitting to staff, for final approval and consistency, and then it goes to development. So this is this is a lot more complicated than just by right development, but I think you've seen, many communities have experienced what by right development leads to, and it's kind of parcelized development. It doesn't contribute to a bigger vision. So this is a more complicated, more sophisticated effort. Not every, it's a specific type of master developer that really has the wherewithal to execute something like this. And that type of developer is not interested in every site, but this is one that we think has that opportunity to attract somebody that can do things at some scale and at a high quality and works with communities like yourself. So, this is a potential process. I wanted to share this with you so you can see how these different pieces would fit, what an overlay does and does not do, for example, and wanted you to see how all these terms and how they would fit in a continuum and how they would address different concerns, different needs between that path between plan and development. So wanted to share that with you. We've got, you can see on the next slide, there's a lot more detail that, there's a lot of different pieces, and I don't know the next slide, Miriam, where we just highlighted the zoning overlay, okay? So it's been a lot of conversation about that. It's an important piece. It's kind of the first piece that you need to do as a city, but just kind of letting you know there's a lot of moving parts. In order to do this, it really does require a partnership. There's a lot of risk being taken on the private side, a lot of sophistication that's required, and a lot of back and forth working in tandem over a period of time. So it's not easy to pull off by any means, but worth it in the end if this is a desired path that you all have and you get benefits that you as a community want and need. So again, there are other paths you can take. You can choose not to change anything. You can choose to allow some lower density by right zoning it's just not going to lead to coordinated development. It's not going to lead to surpluses that allow you to invest in other things. And a lot of the mix of uses, there won't be a strategy to underwrite those. So, for all those reasons, we're putting this forward. I want to kind of share this. I don't know if we have do we have any other slides after this, Miriam? I can't recall. And so, yeah, just kind of that first step. Just want to be clear what an overlay can do. It can create that incentive to opt for the planned development process. It can encourage coordinated land development, establish parameters for minimum and maximum density, communicate those principles that should guide a master plan, and establish and affirm architectural and urban design standards. It won't establish a specific layout or design for the district. That's the next step with the master plan. It won't, in and of itself, fund community benefits. That has to come from that sort of agreement that y'all established after you've got the master plan in place. So just want to share that with you, because we've worked with communities that, hey, why doesn't the overlay require this or that? The overlay serves a some very specific legal and urban design and physical development needs, but there's these other pieces that have to be put in place really in kind of sequential order in order to accomplish the kinds of things that we're talking about. But wanted to share this with you, wanted to let you know that there is a path for communities to do a more complicated but more coordinated development, and a number of pieces that have to go in place. So, appreciate you all bringing that up, and I think that was a nice segue to share this with you. And I think, unless we have another slide that I'm forgetting, Miriam, I think, again, we'll kind of pause to, perhaps get your thoughts on that. And also share, I think, next steps in the process. I think we'd like to let you all digest a lot of this, probably have another round of getting some feedback and direction from you all. If we, need to work with you all to adjust the timeline in any way, we'll do so. But really the idea is in February then we're making some refinements and coming back with something final after that. So maybe if we go back a few slides to that process diagram, Miriam, the clean one, we'll just kind of leave that up. We can move around, but wanted to share that and answer any questions you have about this.
Matt, I think at this point, appreciate you sharing this, and I think if Andy, you can share, because we have 2 council members that just had to leave. So, Matt, you can't see it. I know you can't see it, but we've had 2 council members that had to leave. So, if we could share it with everybody on council, and then we'll have feedback. We'll create opportunity for feedback, additional feedback from what he just shared on the development partnership. So, and everything else you heard, I think loud and clear. You got the feedback from everybody on council this evening too, as well. So, we appreciate it.
Absolutely. We've been taking a lot of notes, so thank you so much.
Andy, did you want to end it off on anything?
I'm just saying, I took a whole bunch of notes too, and I scan them in and send them to Matt, just so you have what I heard in the room, in case you missed something. So 1,000 miles between here and St. Louis.
Okay. Anything else? If not, we are adjourned, and I'm sorry we did go over a little bit longer than normal. So, have a good evening.
Thank you all.